This is Psalms 32, a song written by David of Israel. Oh man, what joy for those of you who get a fresh start, your slates wiped clean and your sins covered over. Yes, what joy for those of you whose record the Lord has cleared of guilt. Listen, God holds nothing against you and you're not holding anything back from Him. To be honest, when I refused to confess my sin, my bones turned to powder. My words became day-long groans. The pressure never let up and all the juice of my life dried up. Selah. Finally, I said to myself, I'll admit all my sins to the Eternal, and you lifted and carried away the guilt of my sin. Suddenly, the pressure was gone, my guilt disappeared, my sin dissolved. Selah. Look, these things add up, and every one of us needs to pray. When all hell lets loose and the dams break, we will be on high ground, untouched. You are my hiding place. You keep me out of trouble and cover me with songs that remind me that I am free. Selah. Let me give you some good advice. I'm looking you in the eye and giving it to you straight. Don't be ornery like a horse or a mule that needs bit and bridle to stay on track. Those who defy God are always in trouble, but the one who trusts in the Eternal is covered by His gracious love. So rejoice in the Lord and be glad, all you who obey Him. Shout for joy, all you whose hearts are pure.
Have you ever received an unexpected, larger than you could ever hope to pay bill in the mail? I mean, your personal ledger, you're barely scraping by. There's no more room for you to even make any more entries. And then you open your mailbox and it's sitting there. That unexpected, larger than you could ever hope to pay bill. Even just looking at the envelope and a drop of sweat begins to form on your forehead and your heart rate begins to pound and you take your ledger and you're beginning to try and figure out where could you even squeeze in another expense, and then the seemingly impossible happens. You go to the mailbox and there's yet another unexpected, larger than you could ever hope to pay bill. But before you can even calculate what you now owe, another past due notice arrives, and then 2 more. And 5 more, and 13 more, 19 more, and 27 more, and 38 more. And before you know it, you are hopelessly buried in more debt than you thought humanly possible. You see, this is a picture from God's perspective. Every sin you and I commit becomes a debt we owe. And this is the picture that David starts with in Psalm 32. Psalm 32 is kicking off this month's chapter a day reading plan. We're going to be going through the month of November from chapter 32 right to chapter 61. Now, Psalms, of course, are song lyrics, and this particular song is divided into 4 sections by the word Selah. Now, Selah means to pause. It means an interruption in the normal flow. It actually literally means for the singers to be silent. So through this service today, we're actually going to experience this psalm as it was intended. And we are going to experience moments of interruption and pause. It's a chance for you to ponder a little bit and let the words of this psalm sink in. But let's study our way to the first interruption, the first call for silence at the end of verse 4 that David gives us. And actually, in the first 4 verses, this is the picture that David has projecting in his mind of a person so hopelessly buried in debt. David says in chapter 1, verse 32, "Oh, what joy for those who get a fresh start. Your slate wiped clean. Your sins are covered over." That phrase, covered over, literally means what buried you is now buried. What was overwhelming you is now overwhelmed. Oh, what unimaginable joy for those who have all of this removed and get a fresh start. Dr. Dave Orez lives in Manhattan. He's just over 60 years old. He's been called the midwife of people's new identity, especially for drug runners, for people who have been imprisoned, for prostitutes, and people who have been humanly trafficked. Dr. Dave, as everybody calls him, is a very, very unconventional doctor. He doesn't have any staff. He doesn't have any nurses that draw blood or send in prescriptions. He cleans his own sink and his own floors. And in fact, he doesn't actually charge people a lot of money for his services. He doesn't accept insurance. He charges people about $100 a visit if they can afford it. And if they can't, he allows them to just come for free. But what he specializes in these days is removing tattoos. He bought a $100,000 laser, and he began using it to remove the tattoos from prostitutes and former inmates who had these tattoos on their hands or on their face, and when they would walk into a prospective employer, they would get rejected because nobody wanted to hire them. So he saw an opportunity to help them out, and he now removes their tattoos for free. So many people started coming to him that he decided he wanted to give his program a name, and he called it Fresh Start. What particularly got me as I read his story was the accounts of women who had been branded by pimps as property, women who had been humanly trafficked and had tattoos. They couldn't look in the mirror or see themselves naked without seeing these tattoos that said property of Carlos, or this meat belongs to so-and-so. I mean, just disgusting stuff. And so Dr. Orriz actually uses his Fresh Start program to remove these brandings. The article told story after story of gang members and former inmates who were trying to be accepted on the inside, but once they got out, they were being rejected on the outside. Each of these formerly branded victims of their own bad choices, in essence, walks out of Dr. Orriz's office and says, "What unimaginable joy came when Dr. Orriz overwhelmed my tattoos with his powerful laser machine and gave me a fresh start." But 3,000 years ago, a man who was the victim of his own bad choices and was branded as an adulterer, as a cheat, as a liar, as a deceiver, as a murderer, said these words, "Oh, what joy for those who get a fresh start. Your slate wiped clean, your sins covered over." What unimaginable joy comes when God overwhelms your sin and gives you a fresh start. But David goes on in verse 2, it says, "Yes, what joy for those whose record the Lord has cleared of guilt. God holds nothing against you." David says the record of my sin is undeniable. The debt I owe is piling up. The ledger is incalculable. David says, I was overwhelmed with my sin and guilt. Because every transgression, every thought fueled by jealousy, every word of anger, every lie, every movie that was played in my head that was lustful, every bit of manipulation, every boastful, prideful thought in me, it all was charged against me and to my account. But what marvelous joy I experienced when God cleared my record of guilt and wiped the ledger clean. Yes, what joy for those whose record the Lord has cleared of guilt. God holds nothing against you. David goes on in the psalm to admit that there was a time in his life when he actually denied that he was a sinner. He chose to ignore the stacks of statements charged to his account. And in verse 3 and 4, he says, "When I refused to confess my sin, my bones turned to powder, my words became day-long groans. The pressure never let up, all the juices of my life dried up." And then he pens this word, Selah. He says, now I want you to interrupt the flow of these thoughts. I want you to take a break. I want you to pause. I want the singers to be silent, and I want you to think about something. So the next minute or two, sitting in relative silence, I'd love for you to answer two questions in your own heart. The first one is, do you know how many debts have been canceled against you? And the second question is, do you have any idea how many brands have been removed from you, giving you a fresh start? Sit for a moment or two and answer those questions for yourself. You know, I used to joke with my kids when they were much smaller, and I would ask with great enthusiasm in the corny kind of way that only a dad can joke, "Does anybody know what day it is today?" And inevitably somebody would say, "It's Wednesday." No, it's actually Tuesday. But besides that, does anybody know what day it is? Is it a holiday? No, it's better than a holiday. Is it Halloween? What? No, it's June. It's not Halloween. Is it payday? No, it's better than payday. And then they would say, well, what day is it today? And I would say, it's the best day of the week. It's garbage day. This is the day when that big blue truck rolls up and takes away all of our mistakes, all of our stinky, yucky garbage that we found at the back of the fridge, all the stuff that we don't want. If we will just roll it out to the curb, this is the day we get a fresh start. Call me crazy, and all joking aside, you know what? I really do get a thrill out of garbage day. I mean, just the fact that somebody is willing to take the worst of my life and take it away so I never have to see it again. But you know, when it comes to sin and the mistakes of our life, some of us are hoarders. Instead of packing it up and rolling it out to the curb for someone to take away, we bury it and we try to hide it and we collect it. You know, about 18 years ago, I found myself on the receiving end of a rather strange phone call. My mom had called me to let me know that my Uncle Ed, who had been a bachelor recluse his whole life, and I really didn't know, had ended up in the hospital, and that his apartment needed to be cleaned out. Now, she must have known something we didn't know, because she said, hey, why don't you gather a few of your friends and I'll give you guys $300 to go and clean up this apartment. I thought, easy money. I mean, he had a one-bedroom little apartment. How hard could it be to go and clean out Uncle Ed's apartment? What my mom failed to tell us was that my Uncle Ed was a hoarder. And when we got to his apartment, we opened the door and we began to walk in, and you literally had to walk down a narrow path through what was probably the living room. You couldn't see any furniture. It was a pathway formed by chest-high piles of newspapers and magazines stacked everywhere. We were hesitant to touch anything. I mean, it was filthy. But we also didn't know, well, what's junk and what isn't. But then we realized we need to actually empty this apartment so someone else can move in. So we began to bag up all the stuff. And we actually discovered a couch and a desk and a chair and a bed. That day we counted 19 wristwatches, 9 electric razors, most of them brand new, an assortment of rubber chickens and Halloween prosthetics, over 20 lighters and 12 tobacco pipes, and at least 5 of every small electric kitchen appliance you could think of. You know, leaving Uncle Ed's place that day with the adventure behind us and the feelings of our heroics starting to fade, I was just sad. I was just sad thinking of this uncle of mine who had lived his whole life collecting and hoarding worthless stuff, jamming it behind his apartment door in an uninhabitable mess. David says, there was a time I was so done with my sin. I was so done collecting it and hoarding it and allowing it to rule my life. So I did what I should have done a long time ago. I packed it up and I wheeled it to the curb and said, God, take this away from me. I confessed my sin. In David's own words, he says, finally, I said to myself, I'll admit all my sin to the Eternal. And you lifted and carried away the guilt of my sin. Suddenly, the pressure was gone. My guilt dissolved. My sin disappeared. Selah. David calls us to another moment of silence, of pondering, of quiet reflection. So here's what we're going to do together. We're going to invite our servers to come and hand out the communion elements. It's a chance for you to take the bread and the cup and to hold them in your hand, remembering the lengths to which God would go to love you. But as we do, I want to ask you a couple of questions for you to answer in your own heart. Is there something sitting in your life that needs to be packed up and wheeled to the curb, allowing God to take it away from you? Is there a sin that you need to admit or to confess so that God can come along and can cover it up and make it unretrievable? I think most of us in this room would have to admit that we've all come to a place in our lives where we've said, when is this dam going to burst? We've stood there looking up at the chaos and the problems in our life, just wondering, how much more can I take? How much more pressure? When will this all just simply let go? David wrote in verse 6 of Psalm 32, these things add up. Every one of us needs to pray. When all hell breaks loose and the dam bursts, we'll be on high ground, untouched. You know, David got me thinking about dams, and right away my mind raced back to 1977. I was 12 years old. It was November the 6th at about 1:30 in the morning when the Kelly Barnes Dam in Toccoa Falls, Georgia burst, and a 40-foot high wall of red silty water came screaming down the canyon, about to overtake a little Bible college that stood in the valley. This was one of the denominational colleges that our church was connected to, so when the news reached us a couple of days later, it hit really close to home. Students and teachers of the Bible college were jarred awake in the middle of the night and immediately found themselves fighting for their life against the rising waters. The next day, they counted the people. 200 were injured, 39 were dead. Dams, by their very nature, are designed to hold back enormous amounts of pressure put against them. Engineers have calculated that at the bottom of the world-famous Hoover Dam, the water is exerting 45,000 pounds of pressure per square foot up against the dam. David's point is that the more you dam up your sin, the more you stuff it down to the bottom of your soul, the more pressure it's going to exert on your life. And one day, all of that sin and all that pressure, it's got to go somewhere. It will crack the dam and it is about to burst, and you will find yourself treading in the floodwaters of judgment. That sin will one day overwhelm and threaten to drown you. But the whole point of David's psalm is not so for those who confess their sin, those who take their sin to the curb and allow God to take it away, those who once were buried by it, but now God buries their sin and covers it over. They will be the ones who are unscathed and safe and standing on dry ground. You know, one way that engineers have devised to relieve the unimaginable pressure is to open the floodgates, to allow what was behind the dam to shoot out through open vents. And that really is what David is encouraging us to do through confession of sin. Through confession of sin, we allow the pressure to be relieved. We allow it to shoot out through those vents rather than creating cracks and bursting our life. You know, 1 John 1:9 says, if we confess our sin, He is faithful and just and will forgive us of our sin and purify us from every unrighteousness. James 5:16 says, so own up to your sins to one another and pray for one another. In the end, you may be healed. Your prayers are powerful when they are rooted in a righteous life. Proverbs 28:13 says, people who conceal their sins will not prosper, but if we confess and turn from them, they will receive mercy. Selah. David once again calls for a moment of interruption and silence, a time for us to take a few minutes just to ponder as we pause. And so as we do, I have a couple of questions I would love for you to answer in your own heart. The first one is this: how open are the floodgates and events of your life? And the second is, when was the last time you confessed your sin, relieving the pressure rather than damming it up? Take a moment to answer these questions in silence. David's Psalm 32 may be 11 verses long, but it has a single message. True joy, true blessing, true freedom, true peace comes when we confess our sin. Instead of hiding them or sinking them behind a dam, allowing God to deal with them by covering them up or wiping them out or carrying them away. However, David also knows his audience, us, human beings with the very same tendencies as his own. So he says in verse 8, let me give you some good advice. I'm looking you in the eye. I'm giving it to you straight. Don't be ornery like a horse or a mule that needs bit and bridle to stay on track. David is saying, don't rely on artificial restraints, like a stubborn or stupid horse or mule that needs leather or steel to keep it in line. Otherwise, it will run wild, ignoring its master. You know, I've never really lived around horses or mules, so I can't comment too much on their behavior. However, our family did have Buddy the hamster. You know, Buddy was a great little hamster. I mean, he was impossibly cute and cuddly and furry. He would run in his little wheel. We'd watch him, or he would bury himself in the wood chips. He would eat sunflower seeds right out of your hand. However, one day, Buddy escaped. We're not exactly sure how he did it, but he managed to get out of his cage, and then, as best we can tell, he hid in some dirty laundry and then rode the laundry chute down into the basement to freedom. I remember looking for Buddy for at least 2 days. I would go down to the basement and try and track him and see if I saw any signs of where he was. And one day I walked into the laundry room and there he was sitting, right in the middle of the laundry room. My first instinct was to kneel down, talk softly to him, and scoop him up into my hand and take him back to his cage. However, as soon as I came within about a meter of him, he went ninja on me. I mean, he was baring his fangs. He went up on his hind legs and struck a ninja pose. He was ferocious. And then he started dancing from side to side. He was going absolutely crazy. And I remember standing in the laundry room watching Buddy jump back and forth with his ninja moves, thinking, dude, you don't stand a chance. You're so tiny. But besides that, I was thinking, why are you fighting me? I'm the one that's trying to get you back to your safe, warm home. Who do you think buys all those yummy sunflower seeds? You stupid, stubborn, ornery little hamster. You see, as soon as Buddy detached himself from his master, something wild inside began to rage, and he became this crazed ninja hamster. He wasn't nice, he wasn't cute, he wasn't cuddly. He was a disturbed, broken, angry hamster, shaking his little hamster fist at me. Using ornery horse and mule language, not hamsters, David says, listen, don't be like that. Don't go thinking that life where you're your own boss and you can do whatever you want is so great, because it's not. Instead of resisting God's instruction, rein yourself in. Marshal those passions and those cravings and use them to serve God. Because he says in verse 10, God defiers are always in trouble, but the one who trusts in the eternal is wrapped tightly in his gracious love. You can trust God with your brokenness. You can trust God with your mistakes and your failures and your sins, because when you do, he takes those stacks of statements against you and he pays the price for you. God takes what you wheel to the curb and what you confess to him, and he hauls it away so you never see it again. He covers it over so it is absolutely unretrievable. God is the God who will declutter your life and your collection of secret sin. God is the God who will set your feet on higher ground and make sure that you are saved from the floodwaters of judgment. And God will wrap you tightly in his gracious love. David has no more Selah, interruption, pause, silence moments. In fact, he tells us the opposite with this instruction in verse 11. So rejoice in the Lord and be glad, all you who obey him. Shout for joy, all you whose hearts are pure.